The Volvo XC60 plug-in hybrid is about performance, not just on the road, but in life, where the only speed that matters is how fast you can slow down. Performance where it matters the most. Visit volvocars.com/US.
This episode is brought to you by AutoTrader. Look around. What do you see? Cars. Lots of them. And guess what? They're probably on AutoTrader. Whether you're into timeless classics or the latest trends, if you see it on the road, you can likely find it on AutoTrader. New, used, electric, and one day, maybe even flying cars. See a car? Find it on AutoTrader. Visit autotrader.com to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, you know, to check you have the tickets in your wallet first before you drive 2 hours to the big game. Seriously, you had one job. Now the closest you'll get to the 50-yard line is parking lot D. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
They were the last British team to complete an Ashes series victory over Australia. And now their achievements have been recognised by becoming the first team to be inducted into the Rugby League Hall of Fame. About time too. Two members of that travelling squad, Jane Banks and Michelle Land, will also be taking their place in the Hall of Fame after being elevated as individuals too. I'm Michael.
And I'm John. The achievement of that squad in 1996 is all the more remarkable considering the obstacles they faced simply to make the tour happen. Back then, Women's Rugby League was not even recognised, let alone supported by the RFL. Thankfully, things have changed, and in this episode of Great British Bosses from Anything But Footy, we'll find out more about how that has happened.
And hello, I'm Julia Lee, a former Rugby League match official and director of the Rugby Football League. I have a passion for women in Rugby League, which uncovers the untold story of women's Rugby League, celebrating the role those pioneers played to inspire the next generation.
Julia, how pleased were you to finally get this in the Hall of Fame? The first team to be inducted in the Hall of Fame. Seems quite apt.
It was a goosebump moment, and I don't often shed a tear, but I must say when I was at the actual meeting when it was agreed, and I didn't do it in the meeting where I wept, but I sort of got in the car and went, it was like one of those moments where, wow, this has happened, this has finally happened. These women are going to have a place in history which they've deserved for so long and being recognised at the highest level in Rugby League, and the only team at the moment to be inducted in, and the first team, which is pretty phenomenal, isn't it?
So just take us back to where we were, mid-1990s. John mentioned in the intro the barriers. What were the barriers at that point?
Well, basically, neither governing body. So the Rugby League had two governing bodies then, which was BARLA, British Amateur Rugby League, and the RFL, which was the Rugby Football League. And right from the 1980s, they didn't really know what to do with women playing. They knew that it would bring in some money if they did a bit of an activity around women. So looking back in time, there's some times when the women played at Old Trafford and part of a British Call Nines at Wigan Central Park, but they didn't embrace it. They didn't formally recognise them as a governing body or as a playing league. So the Women's League was set up first called LARLA, Ladies Amateur Rugby League Association, and then WALA, Women's Amateur Rugby League Association. And they basically forged developing the leagues, the teams, the players. I mean, there was 3 divisions at that time. And basically they got a request from Australia, would you like to come and play us? At that time, there was no money, there was no support, there was no backing. The WALA committee got a guy called Ian Harris, who was a local rugby league development officer in Hull, to come along. And I must say, Ian is a very private man, but when you look back in history, what he did, the selection process, what he put in place for these women, with the intention of women then leading it in the future, it was pretty phenomenal. So they went through everything with no money. The women had to go out bucket collecting, which was always quite demeaning, particularly doing it at rugby league grounds, because of the comments, you were the hooker, and I bet where do you get showered, and all that stuff that people think's funny. But the women did it, and they raised over 50 grand. At that time, there was no bank accounts to hold this sort of money. So Nikki Carter had a briefcase attached to her wrist with a lock with this money in and travelled to Australia with it. And it was really well set out. They had a sports psychologist, everyone doing everything for free, and the women training hard to be able to get there. They then finally arrived at Australia just to find that the facilities were adequate. Very little had been booked for them. Because I've only just found out, actually, in 1993, women were banned from playing rugby league in Australia in 1993, and this was only 1996. So it was very new in Australia for the women, and they weren't supported by their governing body either. So the Australian Rugby League thought women could officiate and coach at a push, but definitely couldn't play. And you look at them now, it's just phenomenal. So women's sport was just the lowest of the low, and they battled against all the odds and came back the victors. I mean, the lovely thing about the story is that they won the test match 2-1. They would say they lost the other test match with a dubious referee, but don't everybody say that? And even as a referee, actually, so I was sent out by the then referee of controllers, because I was refereeing national conference, which is the highest level of amateur. I was refereeing Colts and 18 men, which is a high level of rugby in this country. But when I got there, they made a presumption I couldn't referee, and I had to referee 3 games to prove that I could referee. So all those sort of things were just sort of thrown in the way, and they were quite celebrated in Australia. But when they got back, nothing. Nobody recognised their achievement. Except in the year after at Wembley, they got invited to Wembley, thinking they were going to do a walk around Wembley at the Challenge Cup final, be celebrated, to be taken to a disused warehouse, put in white tracksuits, and given moves to go and get tough to be the pre-match entertainment. Can you imagine it? You're absolutely gobsmacked. You just don't know what to do you, at that point? And some of them were saying, we did it, but we don't know why. But that was the level of publicity they got around it, which up until 2022, they weren't recognised at all.
And you mentioned there the fact that it took so long for that recognition. What kept them going? What kept you going as well?
Well, a pretty phenomenal woman called Jackie Sheldon took on the coaching after 1996. Such a passionate woman. And I think without her, things possibly wouldn't have kept going, because there was then another 4 Great Britain test series. So there was one in 98 to New Zealand. There was a 2000. The first ever World Series was here in the UK in 2000. Another tour to Australia in 2002, and then another World Cup in 2003. Now, up until, again, 2022, the International Federation didn't recognise any of these games. And when I told them the evidence and everything I was collecting, they says, well, we don't have it on record. And I had to point out that the men weren't interested, so they wouldn't have talked about it at board meetings, because they weren't interested. They weren't interested in women's so they had nothing in the minutes, so they were refusing to recognise all these games until I found in the 2003 World Cup programme an article by the then president recognising the 2000 and the 2003 as World Cups, and then the trophy, which hadn't got those World Cups engraved on them, was sent back for engraving, and it was finally recognised. But it took that sort of level of and one of the points around all of this, and particularly when you look at the Australian women in 93, they weren't recognised because the men didn't think they should be playing. So we can't discount what they've done and how they've done it just because a group of men decided women that weren't physically capable of playing rugby league. And some women, to be honest, in the decision-making process. And what makes you carry on is, my particular, speak for myself, is my love for the sport. I loved what I did. And also, anyone says no to me, that's pretty fatal. Or I can't do it.
And you got that recognition. Did anyone say sorry?
Yes, yeah, and the then Ralph Rimmer was then the sort of CEO when they got the caps, and they all got the heritage numbers, and he was there, and I guess there wasn't sorry, but there was recognition of the mistakes to the past. And interestingly, when the decision was made to induct her, there was a question from the group. How do you feel about this? That they've been treated so badly? And the response from Tony Sutton was, it needs telling, and we need to learn from the past. And this is the history. We can't do anything about that. And we need to tell the story of these women and celebrate them, which is a lovely attitude to have, because I think in the past it would have been swept under the carpet and, oh, that's not good for the governing body to find out those things. But that's the reality of women's sport. Rugby league isn't alone in having hidden history and women's stories not being told. It's, and I think Sandy Toksvig's just doing a piece of work around hidden history and women in engineering and the world and all those sort of things, that she's really worried if we don't tell those stories, they'll be lost in history, which is just a fact that, it was hidden. So we just need to tell and give them a voice. And I must say, giving them a voice gives me great joy to see when I told them all that they were in, just the joy and the recognition, and so many of them didn't tell people they were an international player because there wasn't a Wikipedia. People would look them up on Wikipedia and it wouldn't be there, and they'd say, "Nah, you're lying. You've never played." It's all there now for people to see, which is lovely, and for them to be able to celebrate and rekindle old friendships, which is always interesting.
When you use the phrase "give them a voice," I think that resonates quite a lot with John and I, because that's exactly why we started doing our podcast, Anything But Footy, because we wanted to give a voice to all these teams and events and athletes that we felt were overlooked. And full disclosure, we mainly concentrate on Olympic and Paralympic sport, but we have covered rugby league on the podcast before, notably around the Rugby League World Cup, and John Dutton was a previous guest on the podcast. So what did it mean to you that when this country staged that Rugby League World Cup last year, that was a fully inclusive event? There was obviously wheelchair rugby league, there was a men's tournament, there was a women's tournament, and they were all sharing the same stage.
It was huge for me. In 2013, I did, following on from Australia in 2008, I ran a Festival of World Cup. As part of my role as rugby league, bringing in the wheelchair, the women, students, armed forces, and that was big then. But I couldn't get any funding. I was getting very little support. We had 72 games over a 3-week period, and I had to beg, borrow, and steal. And John was he was involved in the World Cup then. So Sally Bolton was running the World Cup and doing a great job with what she did and the resources she had. But he saw my frustrations. I was sat in the office with him. So when, he got involved and was CEO of the rugby, he understood the pain we'd gone through to get where we did. And I said to him afterwards, that's the first time I've ever felt fully included in the sport. And isn't that sad, after 40 years? Can actually feel that you were fully represented and included, and that inclusion, and it was powerful. I don't think it was cheap to do or easy to do, but it was the right thing to do. And those athletes will all say the same, how valued they felt in the sport, of which they've never done in the past. And it just, after my sort of journey personally over the 40 years, but then seeing those athletes getting the center stage as they deserve was, it meant so much to me. And it was lovely to watch and see someone else do it instead of me having to fight and battle.
It was a terrific event. I went to some matches, absolutely loved it. Took my daughter, introduced her to the sport as well. She absolutely loved it. And there's a fan there as a teenager now. Let's go back to your story. What was you mentioned obviously you're a referee. What was your kind of entry point? Where did the love for the sport come from you?
Well, if those of hear my accent, I'm Yorkshire, but I'm actually from Hull originally. So there's a few nines and fives and lager and lambs mixed up in the accent. So when I was a kid, both Hull teams were on a high. So one of my first ever games was watching Roger Millward, and then going to Wembley 1980. My mum's family was from East Hull, so I became a very firm Robin to this day, of which I can celebrate at the moment, because we haven't been near to the top of the league in 40 years, I think. So I'm having a bit of a good season. So that's where it started, and I wanted to play. I got told at school I couldn't play because I was a girl. I've somehow found a whistle as a 12-year-old on the playground when the boys were playing, and was frantically whistling around the playground and dictating. So from early doors, I was possibly going to be a referee. And then I saw an advert in a program that says, we want referees. So it was after a few pale ales. I said, well, I'll do a bit of that. Sent off a letter, of which I got a reply, "Dear Sir, you're very welcome." So I then had to sort of ring them up, and unconsciously I deliberately had just put J. Lee. I know I had. So this "Dear Sir" wasn't a surprise really, and took about 3 months before they and many committee meetings, I think, before they said that I could get involved. I wasn't the first. There was another woman, Julie, who'd been refereeing, but they were really concerned about I wasn't going to bring disgrace on them and change with the men, and how I was going to, manage a brawl. And well, the first game was under 11, so for goodness sake, that I actually got. And at that time there was no training for referees, so I was thrown a whistle and said, off you go. I had to get my own kit, I had to find everything, and it was like, I thought I knew about the laws, but I really didn't. Those under 11s looked very big, and my first, they all came out to watch me, interesting, and they're all good friends now, and we sort of laugh around sort of those first early doors. It was just unfamiliar. They didn't know what to do. It wasn't that they didn't want to make it happen, although I suggest one or two people said women shouldn't be refereeing, but they didn't know what to do at that time. It was working men's clubs, and women weren't allowed in, and that's where they met. It was, the dinners were men only, and all of a sudden this woman was coming in and changing everything, and so the partners and wives were saying, well, if she's going, I'm going. So I didn't realize as a 17-year-old I was making such changes in such ways. I just wanted to be involved in a sport that I loved, and refereeing was a way that I wanted to do it. So I did everything to be the best referee I could be. I went to Australia for a year, refereed in Australia. I picked up open age rugby really early because I moved to London, and that's all they had. So I was refereeing Aussies and expats and everything in London. Learned how to referee on Sunday rugby in Hull, where they used to roll in from being out on the beer and playing rugby. So often 4 or 5, even 6 was my record on a Sunday morning, having to send players off that were still drunk. So I learned how to referee that, and I loved it. It was a lovely way to be involved in the sport, and it's a community as refereeing. But being one of the first, you have to break barriers down constantly of being the first to do something. And it's lovely to see women referees now, at the height of the game and able to referee, and there's no question about what level of games they referee. They just referee rugby league, and it doesn't matter whether it's men or women. I was given lots of women's finals and things like that, but never trusted with a man's final, goodness me. So it was all those sort of things and attitudes, and spectators' views. They always presumed it was my first ever game. You're just constantly reinventing yourself and having to challenge those stereotypes and those assumptions that women can't referee. What would they know?
And you've maintained that love of the game throughout, and women in rugby league. Tell us what that is.
Well, that's interesting. Again, that was born from in 2017. We have all our rugby league archives at Heritage Quay in Huddersfield, and I went in and I was asked to talk a bit about my refereeing and taking my treasures from my loft to talk about it. And they were going to open up the archives for people that were there. And I got there, and the only bit of memorabilia about the women's game was my boxes. And I thought, that's wrong. We need to tell the history of the sport. So that's where it was born from. So women in rugby league came from the ashes. I'm on my 3rd heritage bid now. The first one was more about supporters, but the Life with the Lionesses was around telling the history of initially just the Great Britain women, because no one knew about them. And then we discovered there was, I think, about 50 women for England who'd never received their caps or heritage numbers. They'd given half of them out, but they hadn't given them all out. So they'd been forgotten in history. So it began to get broader. And we went from absolutely nothing to over 300% more archives within Heritage Key, which tells the story of women's rugby league. And there was always a part 2, which was telling the history of women's rugby league right from the 1980s, because I got sick of people saying to me, well, it started in Super League 2017, and some CEOs saying, well, we only had a team in Wigan, from 2017, when actually they were one of the founders in 1988-89. They had teams then. And those women, and there's something, and it's not just women, because without the male allies, women's rugby league wouldn't have started, because no governing body wanted them. And I've talked to some phenomenal men. One guy in his 90s, who's got such a fabulous memory, who fought every inch of his way, one for his daughter to play, but for the team in Dudley Hill to be recognised. He learned how to write in the media so that their stories were told. He was constantly writing letters. You're forgetting about women's rugby league. And without those, and the community clubs, because they started at the community clubs, giving their facilities, and then the match official societies, putting the referees in, women's rugby league wouldn't have started. I mean, we didn't always get best facilities. So Dudley Hill women, the story, Rod Lacey, who was the then secretary, says, we played the last game on a Sunday. The bath water wasn't clean.
And Julia, where are we now? I mean, is it job done? Are you sitting there putting your feet up?
Oh, no, because I'm still in the midst of this project. So I've still got another 1.5 years to go. So I'm doing a timeline of all the women's game. My dream is to have every women's game that was ever played on Rugby League Record Keepers, which is the official archive for women's results and things, and then telling the stories, and to have women's groups in all the areas where that regularly come together, but also look after them as well, because some of these women, have been through some tough times playing their sport, and because of playing the sport, so they get a quality of support from the sport. But at the moment, we don't know where they are, or we didn't know where we are. We're building that. So a bit like players associations, but it's going to be a bit broader than that, like collectives of women that were involved in the sport. I've got about 15 areas I'm targeting, and telling the story in each of those areas, and just getting them together, because they love a get together. Telling their stories gives them a sense of belonging, into the sport, which hopefully some of them might come back in and do masters or wheelchair or get involved in the sport in another way. But first of all, it's giving them that sense and saying thank you for what you did at that time, because we know it wasn't easy.
Well, as ever, we could carry on chatting for most of the rest of the day with you, Julia, but time has beaten us, and I think that's quite an apt point to finish the podcast by saying thank you. And we'll say thank you to you, Julia Lee of Women in Rugby League. Thank you for speaking to Great British Bosses from Anything But Footy.
My absolute pleasure.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
I'm Victoria Cash, and I want to invite you to a place called Lucky Land, where you can play over 100 social casino-style games for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. So what are you waiting for? The best way to discover your luck is to spin. So go to LuckyLandSlots.com, that's LuckyLandSlots.com, and get lucky today. At Lucky Land.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.